today, inshallah, we are blessed that we have Brother YOUSUF HABIB is going to give the talk about Ayah 7 from Surah Aalay Imran, المتشابهات المحكمات. But just because sometimes people come here often enough, every time, and people do not actually know who they are. So I wrote something about him. Anybody knows actually details about you. Everybody knows about everybody. We don't actually. But anyway. So, interesting that he had a master degree, in chemical engineering from University of Montreal. And then he have a master in business administration and international business from Rutgers University from Newark, New Jersey. And he worked as a senior business analyst and the principal oil consultant in Saudi Aramco, but part of Exxon. Oh, somebody pointing to you and said, I saw this guy. Yeah, and he worked, but I think he was part of Exxon and then he joined them. And that was a long time, 22.5 years. But after that, he opened his own company and worked with BP and other companies to basically develop their strategy for longer-term strategy. And I said he was external senior advisor for BP for 12 years. And also for working for the McKinsey, advisor in McKinsey company, which is a business, company, also for 7 years. So he is a very well versed. I actually bought some of his quotes, in the business and the expectation in the oil business from, about 10 years ago, and checked if he was actually right or wrong, but I didn't, So now he is going to talk about this verse. So let's listen to it, and then he can come and I can stop the, basically the share, because he is going to speak directly without any slides. So let's listen to the verse first, inshallah.
الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات فأما الذين في قلوبهم زيغ فيتبعون ما تشابه منه ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله والراسخون في العلم يقولون آمنا به كل من عند ربنا وما يذكر إلا أولو الألباب.
صدق الله العظيم. Now I'm going to stop share now, and then you can come now and make his presentation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم من نفخه ونفثه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. 2 weeks ago, Brother Mamdouh, I interchange both of them quite frequently. He gave a talk on the theme of Surah Aalay Imran, and he did put up this particular ayat for us to listen to, and then commented on it a little bit. And at the end of his conversation, just on a one-on-one basis, I went and spoke with him for a few minutes, and I pointed out to him that one particular expression in this ayat, ayat mutashabihat, that was the reference to, has been considered by many scholars over the centuries as a key phrase of the many key phrases, a most important key phrase from the many key phrases in the Quran. Another one says that this particular ayat is the most important ayat that deals with the interpretation of the Quran. And I'll talk to you more about that as we go on. So I told him that it would be useful if people did pay attention to this particular term and try to gauge a sense, intuitive sense of this particular expression. And if people were to look into it, you will find out that over the centuries, tons of books must have been written about this particular aspect of the Quran. And it runs the whole gamut, the whole spectrum, from some people who say all Quran is ayat mutashabihat. Someone says all ayat in the Quran are ayat muhkamat, and then there is a whole lot in between. So suffice it to say that the subject itself is fairly elaborate. The conversation on this goes on. I don't think it will end. For the right reason, because by definition, it is subjecting itself to more and more interpretations. Anyway, with Brother Shahzado and Brother Mamdouh here have been with us for many years, I feel at best a novice when compared to them. So I really hope and pray that you overlook my shortcomings and please don't compare myself to them. I remain perennially a more humble student than you can ever imagine. So the translation of this particular ayat, and I try to look at this ayat in three parts. And I'm going to talk about one term from the first part. I'm going to refer to first part, second part, and third part, particularly the second and the third towards the end. And but I'd like to focus on this particular expression, ayat mutashabihat, and everything will flow from it. So let me give you the translation, not thoroughly literal, but as literal as possible, but with some interpolation here. So we start with it is Allah who has sent you from on high this Quran, containing messages that are clear in and by themselves. These are the ayat muhkamat. And these form the essence of the Quran. What the ayat says is Kitab. So again, it is Allah who has sent you upon you from high this Quran, containing messages that are clear in and by themselves, ayat muhkamat. These are the essence of the Quran. And other messages that are allegorical, ayat mutashabihat. I'm going to dwell plenty on the word allegorical, so let's not go into that right now. So this forms the first third of the ayat, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces for us the concept of ayat muhkamat and ayat mutashabihat, with an interjection that ayat muhkamat form the essence of the Quran. The second of the three, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes back and says, now there are those whose hearts tend to move away from the truth. They swerve from the truth. These people go after that part of the Quran which has been expressed in allegory, that is ayat mutashabihat. They seek out what is bound to create confusion, and they arrive at the allegorical narrative's final meaning in an altogether arbitrary manner. In other words, either they have a bias on their own, or they have a certain set of assumptions, but the end result is that they come up with a result, understanding of that ayat in a most arbitrary manner. And so right after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you in no uncertain terms, but no one except Allah knows its final meaning. So in the second part of the three parts of this ayat, he introduces us to those whose hearts tend to swerve away from the truth. They try to do something that ultimately results in creating confusion, and they do so by arriving at the final meaning in an arbitrary manner. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns and states unequivocally that no one except him knows its final meaning. The last part of this ayat, he then comes and says something about men and special kind of men. And he says, hence, those who are deeply rooted in true knowledge, knowledge can be good or bad, sincere or insincere. Those who are deeply embedded with knowledge that is true, knowledge that is sincere, and only one's heart can tell you what is true and sincere. They are the ones who say, we believe in it. In other words, what we just read in the ayat, they say we believe in it, and the whole of this Quran is from our sustainer. In other words, those who are sincerely embedded in true knowledge, they say we believe what is said here, and we believe that all of this, i.e. the Quran, is from our sustainer. And then Allah Ta'ala closes this ayat with a further elaboration on these sorts of people by saying, meanwhile, no one takes to heart all this to heart, except the men of understanding, ulul albab, those who are endowed with insight that arises from their deep reflection upon the message. So here we have two definitions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives very succinctly. Those who are embedded with true knowledge, and those who are in deep reflection, use their intellect and come up with an insight that resides with them, and these are the men of understanding. That particular phrase, ulul albab, appears about 23 times in various forms in the Quran. So anyway, so this then is the ayat's general description as it appears in the light of what I can interpret and what I agree with the interpretation in the translation of the Quran, which is not the ayats of Quran, it is simply a translation of the Quran. The respected scholar Tabari regards ayat muhkamat as those statements or ordinances of the Quran which do not allow more than one interpretation, because they are, as we said early on, clear in and by themselves. They're decisive, they're determined with little room for more than one meaning. Additionally, ayat muhkamat are described, as I said earlier, as the essence of Quran, because they consist of the fundamental principles that underlie the Quran's overall message, and particularly its ethical and social teachings. Now, I'll mention on muhkamat just this much, and I may refer to it with reference to how, as it relates to ayat mutashabihat, but let me now move on to the focus of this talk, ayat mutashabihat. In Quran, the root letters sheen, ba, and ha, shabaha, words coming out of it appear about 12 times. The word mutashabihat, it's an adjective. As an adjective, and it is an adjective to the noun ayat. So ayat, further qualified as ayat mutashabihat, just like muhkamat is an adjective for ayat, which are muhkamat. It only appears once in the Quran in this particular ayat. Ayat mutashabihat appears only once as an adjective in the Quran in this ayat, and it appears vis-a-vis ayat muhkamat. So it's sort of a counterpoint to ayat muhkamat. Not exactly, but one should try to gauge its meaning or its interpretation in the light of ayat muhkamat that appear in the same ayat. And so we need to keep that in mind. Translators of the Quran have used various terms for those ayats. So if you were to go to Corpus Quran and look up 8 or 10 translations, you will see that they say ayats that are not entirely clear, unspecific ayats, ayats that have several possibilities, ayats that are symbolic, ayats that are ambiguous. And we, as you noticed, translated ayat mutashabihat here as allegorical passages, because an allegory is a symbolic narrative, including parables, that conveys a meaning that is not explicitly set forth in the narrative. In other words, ayat mutashabihat are those passages or statements of the Quran which are expressed in figurative or symbolic manner with a meaning or meanings that are implied but not explicitly stated, and so they may be interpreted in more than one way. I know it's a long-winded, but just think about it so that let it kind of seep in. If you're going to look into Dictionary of English, you will find 4 words, and after a while you will be confused because they end up being very similar. One is figurative, the other is symbolic, the third is metaphorical, and the fourth is allegorical. when you come right down to it, much of it for an average person should be the same. A symbol is a symbol, a figure is a figure. I'll just give you, he is the head of the company. Okay, this is a metaphor. It's a metaphorical sentence. Why is a metaphorical sentence? Because it directly does not say to you anything. It says head of the company. But what it is saying is that just as my head is on top of my body, so he is on top of his company. He's the leader, and he is at the helm of the company. The head itself is a symbol or a figure here. He is the head of the company is a metaphor. And if you were to take this kind of a passage in a religious write-up, most scholars will say this is an allegorical narrative. Mostly, not all the time, but much of the times, religious scholars, when they talk about symbolic narrative or a figurative narrative or metaphorical narrative, they use the word allegorical narrative. And for my own purposes, when I read allegorical narrative, my first thing is to say, probably we are talking here about something that has to do with religion. One other thing I should add, we here live in a physical world, so our assessments are relative to what we know and what physically sense, in many senses. Then there is the other world. The otherworldly affairs are otherworldly, and they are outside our physical domain, and therefore, in English, for example, the word that is used is metaphysical. When we hear the word metaphysical, we should say, this is otherworldly. It is outside of our physical realm. It's up above there. So in Qur'an particularly, and in all religious write-ups, you will see that much, if not majority, is with reference to the metaphysical, the otherworldly. Now keep that in mind as I move on. This is very important, so you just keep in mind that one. Ayat mutashabihat, however, can be interpreted only on the basis of the clearly enunciated principles that underlie ayat muhkamat. Why do I say that? Because as we just said, muhkamat are clear in and by themselves, and they consist of the fundamental principles underlying the Qur'an's overall message, in particular its ethical and social teachings. So if that is so, no ayat can contradict that particular one. So if an interpretation of an ayat mutashabihat contradicts that, you can say that is not a valid interpretation. So I just want to put this qualifier aside and leave it there. Mufassir Muhammad Asad has suggested that without a proper understanding of what is implied by or what underlies the allegorical or symbolic verse, that is an ayat mutashabihat, much of the Quran is liable to be, indeed it has often been, largely misunderstood both by believers and those who refuse to believe in Quran's divinely inspired origin. Another scholarly work states that this verse is perhaps the most direct discussion of the science of Quranic interpretation. However, in order to appreciate the use of allegory or symbolism in the context of the Quran, one must relate this Quranic use of allegory or symbolism to another aspect, or rather another concept that the Quran touches upon at the very beginning in Ayat 3 of Surah Baqarah, the concept of al-ghayb. I'd like you to pay close attention to is as to why I have digressed from discussion of mutashabihat to the concept of al-ghayb. Mostly when you will see the translation you will see is unseen. I think it's a very limited translation of al-ghayb, because unseen leads you to believe that only one sense of your sight, that if you cannot use, that's al-ghayb. I don't think that that is a true appreciation of this concept. It is the existence of a realm of reality that is beyond the reach of human perception. Let me repeat this. It's that realm of reality that is beyond the reach of human perception. A reality as a whole is a much bigger reality than the reality we experience. There is a whole spectrum of reality. the largest spectrum of that reality is outside our perception. The largest spectrum of that reality, the largest realm of that reality is outside human perception. Just like we are not able to see ultraviolet, ultra-red, infraviolet, and other colors, just that particular aspect, just multiply it infinite number of times, that is how much we do not have perception of what comprises total reality. So now let me elaborate more on that. Indeed, al-ghaib is the concept that is the basic premise for understanding of call of Qur'an. After he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is the guide book, the guidance for the muttaqi, that is, who are conscious of my being, and then he immediately goes, they are the ones, allazina yu'minuna bil ghaib. So the first characteristic of definition of he who believes by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the concept of al-ghaib. There is no way that I can believe in him, that I can be able to understand what the Quran says without the proviso that I truly believe that there is this al-ghaib, there is this reality beyond my perception, and I have to always keep that in mind. Without this, I'm an abject failure when it comes to being a believer. Okay. So more on it. As a matter of fact, all truly religious understanding arises from and is based upon al-ghaib, not just the Quran. The fact that, again, only a segment, small segment of reality is open to man's perception and his imagination, by far the largest part of this reality escapes man's comprehension altogether. This amazes me many times when I'm sitting with people who are Muslims and feel that they are very pragmatic, that they're very modern, they're very knowledgeable, to the point where they say, well, you know, this al-ghaib is all hocus pocus, you know, let's move on to something else. And the reason why it boggles my mind is the following. Now, let me just read this because I want to make sure that I read. This is aside from our conversation, but it is very germane to the idea of al-ghaib and why I appreciate it. The actual universe is currently estimated by the most scientific minds to be 250 times the size of the observable universe. Of the observable universe itself, 95%, the scientists themselves confess, is unknown. Dark energy and dark matter. It is dark because they say they do not know how to define it. 95% of the observable universe is undefinable by the most scientific knowledge that we currently have. And only 5% is known. Therefore, today's science has enabled man to grasp, if you calculate, a barely 0.0002% of the actual universe, all the while the universe is expanding. And the Quran says that, and the scientific knowledge says that. Self-humility, not arrogance, is called for. So here is an example from today's science that says how much we do not know. And there is this 1450-year-old book that says there is the al-ghaib, and if you want to know me, believe in it. Now, having talked about this otherworldly al-ghaib, and starting off with al-mutashabihat, we cannot ignore the fact that the human mind and his thought process can operate only on the basis of perceptions experienced by that very mind. The human mind cannot visualize or form an idea of something that is totally outside the realm of that mind's previously realized experiences. And this is why the Quran insists that a true believer believes in the concept of al-ghaib. Okay, so as soon as we realize that the human mind can only operate on the basis of his own understandings and his own perceptions, we are faced with a challenging question. How can the metaphysical, the otherworldly ideas of religion that relate to a realm that is beyond the reach of human perception or experience, how can they be successfully conveyed to men? How can man grasp the ideas that have no counterpart in any of the perceptions that he has arrived at empirically through his own experiences? The answer, however, for a thinking intellect is obvious. We can grasp such ideas that are beyond the reach of our perception by means of images derived from our own experiences. And this is the ultimate purpose of the term and the concept of al-mutashabihat as used in the Qur'an. Symbolic passages appeal to us. In religious term, allegorical narratives appeal to us because it is through symbolic and figurative messages that we can relate to otherworldly metaphysical ideas. The Quran itself points out that many of its passages must be understood in a symbolic, figurative, allegorical sense, and so it could not have been conveyed to us in any other way. And therefore, if we took every Quranic passage only in its outward literal sense and disregard the passage or the statement or the expression may be symbolic, we would be offending against the very spirit of the Quran. Okay, in the light of this, what is mutashabihat, in the light of the fact that there is this al-ghayb, in light of the fact that there is our limited perception, in light of the fact that it is the symbolic passages, the allegorical narratives of the Quran that we come to appreciate, or begin to appreciate the otherworldly, the metaphysical aspects that are in Quran, and much of the Quran, if not most of the Quran, is dealing with that. Let us, by way of illustration, consider Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's being. His being is indefinable. It is infinite in space and time. It is utterly beyond man's comprehension. We cannot imagine him. We can only realize what he is not. He is not limited in space and time. He is not definable by way of comparison. Lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. There is nothing that is comparable to him. And no category of human thought can comprise him. Take all human thought, you will still not be able to circumscribe, comprise the totality of his being. Hence the idea of his existence as well as activity that is currently happening, has been happening and will always happen, is conveyed in Quranic references to man by very generalized metaphors. So for instance, when the Quran speaks of Allah as being in the heavens or established on his throne, al-arsh, we cannot take these phrases in their literal sense. Why? Because doing so would imply that Allah is limited in space. But such a limitation contradicts concept of an infinite being. And so, without any doubt, we know that the heavens and the throne and Allah's being established on the throne are only linguistic means to convey to us an idea that is, as a matter of fact, outside of our experience. And what is that idea? It is the idea of Allah's almightiness and absolute control over all that exists. The heavens and the throne and Allah established on the throne are symbols that convey the idea of Allah's almightiness and all-controlling aspect of his being. In the same fashion that Allah is all-seeing, all-hearing, all-aware, they simply convey in terms understandable to us the idea of Allah's eternal presence in all that is and all that happens. The idea underlying these terms by way of symbols are meant to convey to us his eternal presence in all of creation and in all of the activity of that creation. The all-seeing, all-hearing limits to only two senses. No, there is his eternal presence. We can only convey, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can only unpack these ideas to us human beings through the terms that we can understand, but we never should limit his being to those words and to those expressions. That would be counter to the idea of his being of his being unlimited in space and time. Now, man is not expected to realize Allah's existence directly, because the Quran itself in Surah An'am, ayat 103 says, La tudrikuhul absaru. That is, no human vision can encompass him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Furthermore, because of the limitations of the human language that arise from the limitation of the human mind, Allah's activity cannot truly be described to man. Instead, the Quran uses many symbolic expressions that relate to Allah's activity, and man is expected to realize Allah's existence through observing the effects of his ongoing activity around us. Just as it is impossible to imagine or define Allah's being, the true nature of his creativeness and his plan of creation remains beyond human beings' grasp. But since the Quran aims at conveying to us ethical teachings based precisely on the concept of Allah's purposeful creativeness, this creativeness of his can only be translated into categories of thought that are accessible to man. And so the use of such expressions, for example, as Allah's wrath, condemnation, his pleasure at good deeds, his love for his creatures, his asking a wrongdoer on resurrection day about his wrongdoing, all such translations of Allah's activities into human terminology are unavoidable, because we, men and women, are expected to follow the ethical principles that have been revealed to us by means of a human language. Our language limits us. But keep in mind a key point for the believer through this discussion. As Muslims, our belief in Allah's existence does not solely depend on our grasping the unfathomable how of Allah's being, because the Quran tells us that a believer is he who, among several tenets, believes in al-ghaib, because no human vision can encompass Allah. So the symbolic narrative, the allegorical narrative, takes us only so far. The most scholarly of the scholar will be able to interpret ayat mutashabihat so far. But he, alhamdulillah, will be a true believer, because while he has interpreted in the best way he knows these ayat mutashabihat, he all along this has the appreciation that he believes in al-ghaib. One of them is a necessary but not a sufficient condition, but the two of them become necessary and sufficient. This is to be kept in our mind whenever we try to assess anything as it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ayat. So now let us look by way of illustration at an issue that is connected with man's own existence. Okay, we just spoke about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's being. Let's bring it down to earth and think about our own existence. And as an example, the idea of life in the hereafter. Mind you, ayat mutashabihat, the discussions that are metaphysical, otherworldly in the Quran, are many. The whole concept of shaitan and iblis, the whole concept of Adam being told names, the concept of heaven and hell, the concept of resurrection day, the concept of resurrection per se, all these are things that you and I do not know for sure what they are in point of fact. Much, if not all of it, through symbolic messages. Keep that in mind. Now here is one example, life in the hereafter. An intellectual comparison between the two stages of human existence in this dunya and in the hereafter is limited for us, because our thinking and imagination is connected with concepts of finite time and finite space. We cannot imagine the infinity of the hereafter, and so we cannot imagine existence that is independent of space and time. Also, man's psyche is so constituted that it cannot accept any proposition relating to himself without being given a clear expression of its purpose. So how could man be made to understand the nature of the consequences of all his conscious actions and his behavior in his life, and thus the quality of life that awaits him after death? After all, the Quran asserts that man's resurrection will be a new act of creation. And so the life that will follow after this new act of creation will be entirely different from anything that man experiences in this world. Well, if that is the case, that it is not enough for men to be told, oh, if you do wrong in this world, you will suffer in the hereafter. Or if you behave righteously in this world, you will attain to happiness in the life to come. Such statements are too general and abstract to appeal to man's imagination and thereby influence his behavior. What is needed is a more direct appeal to man's intellect that results in a kind of visualization of the consequences of one's acts and omissions. Such an appeal can be produced effectively by means of allegories and metaphors, by ayat mutashabihat. Allegories and metaphors, symbolic and figurative, stress the dissimilarity of all that man will experience after resurrection from whatever he experienced in this world. Now, we are all aware of the so many ways symbolically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of paradise and all that will be. Some of the aspect that Brother Mamdou referred to this morning after the prayers when he was giving out those rewards. I don't know how deep his wallet is, by the way. It just keeps on taking out these bills and giving them out. Alhamdulillah. And hell, you know. The first surah that I memorized after the small ones was a surah when I was listening on Fajr morning in, I think it was Masjid Nabwi. And the reciter started crying towards the end of Surah Al-Haqqa, and you all know why he did. And it moved me so much that I went and memorized that surah. And then subsequently, I memorized quite a few larger surahs. And it was the horrific pictorial visualization of the person who has not believed, who has been given the book not in his right hand, and the things he will experience. And the reason why he cried, why I cry, why we all cry, is because we are able to visualize that which hell is going to be. The idea is through those symbols to give you an inkling of what hell is going to be. So let me elaborate on that. Take a look at these descriptions of paradise and hell. In both cases, Quranic descriptive method is the same. It is as if the allegorical descriptions describing paradise and paradise, for example, suggest the following. Imagine the most joyous sensations accessible to man: indescribable beauty, physical and spiritual love, perfect peace and harmony. And now imagine these sensations intensified beyond anything imaginable in this world and totally different from anything imaginable. Now you get an inkling of what is meant by paradise. Similarly, imagine greatest suffering, bodily as well as spiritual, which man may experience: burning by fire, utter loneliness, bitter desolation, condition of neither living nor dying. And imagine this pain, this darkness, this despair intensified beyond anything imaginable in this world, and at the same time entirely different from anything imaginable. And you know, however, vaguely what is meant by hell. This is what the Quran is telling us when it's through symbolic messages, telling you to visualize what these two entities will be, paradise and hell. This is what the Quran is getting across man through allegories, symbols, and metaphors about the notion of heaven and hell. This is what the ayat mutashabihat pertaining to the metaphysical aspects of Allah's being and of heaven and hell, as examples given here, are being conveyed to man whose comprehension is limited to his physical, earthly, sensory experience. All that said, however, in the final analysis, there can be no bigger mistake than to think that these attempts at mere translations of Allah's being and paradise and hell as examples could ever enable us to define and describe the undefinable and undescribable with upper cap U in both cases. This is why Ayat 7 of Aalay Imran, after it has introduced in its first part the concept of muhkamat and mutashabihat, in its second part, the ayat makes it clear that there are those whose hearts tend toward moving away from the truth. They are the ones who go after that part of the Qur'an which has been expressed in allegorical term, that is, they go after ayat mutashabihat, and they come up with such ayats, final meaning in a most arbitrary manner that suits them, and thereby they create confusion among people. Verse 7 of Aalay Imran, meanwhile, goes on to say that no one except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows its final meaning. The verse in its third part then closes by asserting that those who are deeply rooted in true knowledge say, we believe in it. The whole of this Quran, all its ayat, is from our sustainer. This comprehensive belief of the believer that is mentioned here in verse 7 is squarely grounded on his belief in al-ghaib, that realm of reality that is totally outside of man's comprehension and imagination. It is in the spirit of that belief in al-ghaib that the believer understands the allegorical narrative of the Quran. And the verse finally ends with Allah's dictum that no one takes this, that with Allah alone resides the final meaning. No one takes this to heart except the man of understanding, those who are endowed with insight, and insight that arises from their deep reflection upon the message. لَقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. The apparent ambiguity embedded in mutashabihat has led to multiple interpretations of these through the centuries. Many of these elucidate, yes, but others confuse. For a lay person like myself, this can be altogether overwhelming. As Muhammad Asad points out, a true allegory is always meant to express in a figurative manner something which, because of its complexity, cannot be adequately expressed in direct terms or propositions. It can be only grasped intuitively and not as a series of detailed statements. And this seems to be the meaning of the phrase in Surah Aalay Imran, verse 7, none save Allah knows the final meaning. I'd like to end this discourse with what Professor Yusuf Ali wrote more than 90 years ago when commenting on Ayat Mutashabihat, and he said, it is very fascinating to take up such ayat and exercise our human ingenuity about its inner meaning. However, these ayat refer to such profound spiritual matters that human language is inadequate to it. And although people of wisdom may get some light from these, no one should be dogmatic, insistent, be simplistic enough to insist that their interpretation is the right one, because the final meaning is known to Allah alone. A wise man will understand that throughout the Quran, there is the essence of the Quran, muhkamat, and then there is an illustrative clothing given to that essence, mutashabihat. We must try to understand as best we can, but we must not waste our energies in disputing about matters beyond our depth. I must say that none of this work is mine. I have merely taken Mufassir Muhammad Asad's work on this topic and put it the way I knew best in front of you. His explanation of the Quran remains on most occasions for me, my go-to source in matters Quranic. In the final analysis, of course, Allah alone knows best. Thank you.
اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه. اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت وعافنا فيمن عافيت وتولنا فيمن توليت وبارك اللهم لنا فيما أعطيت وقنا واصرف عنا شر ما قضيت فإنك يا ربنا تقضي بالحق ولا يقضى عليك. اللهم ادخلنا برحمتك في عبادك الصالحين. اللهم اخرجنا من ظلمات الجهل والوهم إلى نور العلم.
اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم اجعلنا ممن يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه. اللهم اكفنا بحلالك عن حرامك وبطاعتك عن معصيتك وفضلك عن من سواك. اللهم بفضلك ورحمتك على كلمة الحق والدين. اللهم انصر الإسلام وعز المسلمين يا أكرم الأكرمين. Oh Allah, spread your mercy upon us, shower us with your blessing, increase our knowledge, grant us forgiveness, and reward us with the company of the prophets in the Firdaus al-A'la. Oh Allah, reward our speaker for his eloquent and clear description to us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala add these in his rewards in paradise and in Firdaus al-A'la, inshallah. Oh Allah, forgive our parents and all our friends and relatives who have passed away. Oh Allah, grant them your mercy, make their graves garden from heaven, and grant them the Firdaus al-A'la. Oh Allah, we have many of our friends and relatives who are sick. Oh Allah, we have our son Ma'raj, our daughter Aisha Wani, and our brother Munshi and his wife. Oh Allah, grant all of them full and speed recovery. Oh Allah, guide our children, protect them, and make them righteous. Oh Allah, grant us the power and the ability that we may be grateful for your favor that you have bestowed upon us and our parents, and that we may do righteous deeds that are pleasing to you. Oh Allah, we ask you with every name you have elected for yourself, that none of us leave this gathering, but his pains have been relieved, his worries have been removed, his debts have been paid, his weaknesses have been concealed, his sins have been forgiven, and his needs have been fulfilled. سبحان الله وبحمده عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. سبحان الله وبحمده عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. سبحان الله وبحمده عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.